All right, so the point of tonight is to talk about COVID in general, but primarily to start by talking about how these two vaccines that are available to people are going to work, um, so that uh, people can be informed about whether they're going to want to get vaccinated. And I'll give away the spoiler that I hope everyone will decide to get vaccinated when they get their chance. And so I want to give the information about how these vaccines work and why you should not have to be worried about it. But after I give my little spiel, we'll be able to have some question and answer, and then we can talk more broadly about COVID topics for anyone who wants to stick around. And anyone can drop out at any time. I'm not going to be offended if anyone drops out. All right. So to understand how these Pfizer and Moderna vaccines work, we need to start with learning a little bit about the biology of how cells work. And I have an image that I am going to share that's going to help a little bit, but I'm going to try to avoid a lot of jargon as much as possible. So let's see if I can get this. All right. So in the center of our cells, the part of the cell that's called the nucleus, we have something called DNA. I imagine most people have heard a little bit about DNA. It's that thing that has the two chains going along, and it's often talked about as being sort of the blueprint of life. It's made up of something called nucleic acids, and it encodes all the information that's needed to build everything that we need to be human beings. And if you're a mouse, it has everything you need to be a mouse. And this DNA is made up of an alphabet that's very small. It has only 4 letters in it. They happen to be A, C, G, and T. And those stand for it's the first letters of the nucleic acids that make it up. And the sequences of all these letters make up our genes. So we can kind of think of the DNA as if it was a cookbook with many recipes in it, where each one of those recipes is a gene. And this cookbook is very large. It has about 30,000 recipes in it. I happen to look up that The Joy of Cooking has about 1,400 recipes, so it's got it beat by a long shot. So it's got about 30,000 recipes in it. Now, there are parts of the cell that are inside the nucleus that are responsible for making copies of each one of those recipes. And when they come along to the DNA strand that had, one of them might have like 1,000 recipes on it in one of our chromosomes, and it'll create a copy of one of those recipes. And that copy is called RNA. And the NA in DNA and the NA in RNA both stand for nucleic acid because they're both made up of largely the same things. This RNA is called messenger RNA, and there's 3 different types. You don't need to know what the other types are, but this messenger RNA is sometimes called mRNA, and it happens that these vaccines are mRNA vaccines. So we're going to learn about what this mRNA does. So that little strand of mRNA is kind of like a recipe, and it gets sent out of the nucleus to roam around in the cell. And there's other parts of the cell that are kind of like chefs that know how to interpret a recipe. Now, one thing that is interesting to note is the alphabet of RNA is a little bit different from DNA. It shares 3 of those letters, but one of the letters, the T, is replaced with a U. It happens you can arrange them into guac, like guacamole. So it's almost like the recipes, like the original cookbook in the nucleus of the cell is written in Spanish, but the cooks only know Portuguese. So these recipes get translated into Portuguese and sent out into the cell. Okay. So these cooks come along, they see the recipes, and they start cooking up proteins. These RNAs are used to make proteins. And from the 30,000 genes that we have, they can make about 100,000 proteins. So it's kind of like you have a recipe, and then you have the gluten-free version of the recipe, and you have the high altitude version of it or whatever. Some of these recipes can make more than one protein, and we have somewhere about 100,000, and it may be as much as 400,000, as little as 50,000. You know, they wonder, but it's about 100,000, most people think. Um, so these proteins get created, and other parts of the cell will then carry these proteins and put them together with others, and that basically makes practically everything that we are. So when you look at somebody, you're looking at essentially a big blob of very well organized proteins. And and so those proteins are really kind of the building block of life. So those proteins that float around in the cell, not all of them get picked up by something that comes along and uses it. And they make their way out to the cell wall. And they get embedded into the cell wall, and they even stick out of the cell wall. And that's going to become important in a moment. Okay, but that's sort of enough about how normal cells work. So let's now look at what happens when a virus comes in to mess with things. All right, move. Hold on a sec. Okay. So when a virus comes along, specifically the coronavirus, it is made up of an RNA strand as well. So it has essentially messenger RNA inside of it, surrounded by a protective layer. And so it's as though it already has its own cookbook written in Portuguese that those chefs are going to know, and it has about a dozen recipes. And what this virus wants to do is it wants to find cells, it wants to get inside them, and it wants to trick all those cooks into making more copies of itself. So once it gets in through the cell wall, its RNA gets released into the cell, and those same things that come along and for all of our good RNA make all the proteins we really want, they come along and they very faithfully make the proteins that the coronavirus wants. And some of these proteins are used to build something that allows it to replicate its own RNA. Some of it is used to create the membrane covering for it. And some of them are used to create these little spikes on the outside. So these little spikes on the outside, those green spikes, are proteins. There is a protein, and they call that the spike protein. Now, those same proteins that are being created to create the virus, again, not all of them end up making viruses. Some of those float out and get to the wall of the cell, and they get embedded in the cell wall, just like I said, some of our good proteins do. So all cells have a bunch of proteins that show on the outside of them that tell you what kind of proteins are inside that cell. So this is where the immune system comes in. In our blood, we have white blood cells that roam around, and they check the surface of cells, and they look for those proteins, and they know about all the good proteins. And when they see one that doesn't look good, they consider it a bad protein. And we call a bad protein an antigen. So these white blood cells, if they find a cell that has antigens on the outside, they'll destroy that cell. Okay, but they don't stop there. They also release some chemicals into the bloodstream that tells the rest of the immune system, we're being attacked, kick yourself into higher gear, start looking for baddies. And then they also carry the garbage of this cell that it just destroyed into the lymph nodes, where there's some very special cells called B cells that make something called antibodies. So your body has millions of different types of B cells that make millions of different types of antibodies. And there's a fairly good chance in all those antibodies that there's one of them that is already able to bind to some of those proteins that make up the virus. So antibodies, what they want to do is they want to chemically connect up to the proteins, to any protein, but they especially want to find a protein that has just the configuration they need, and they'll bind with it. And the nice thing about that is those antibodies do two things. One, once they bind, they have a little chemical marker that says, I found somebody bad, now destroy me, and they'll get found and eaten up by the white blood cells. But also, when they bind to those proteins, they might make it so those proteins can't do what they really want to do. Okay? And that's what's really important about that is this spike protein is exactly what the coronavirus uses to infect our cells. And it infects cells that have a particular type of receptor on them called ACE2, but I'm not going to go too much into that, except to say those cells are in your lungs, they're in your upper respiratory system, they're in your intestines, some of them are in your brain, and that's why this is a respiratory illness. That's why there are some neurological symptoms if you get COVID. It's part of why you might have diarrhea if you get COVID. But these antibodies, if they can latch onto them, they can then prevent the coronavirus from getting into your cells and mark them for destruction. And if they get ahead of the race, if they're marking more of them than are being created inside your cells, you will get better. And that happens because when one of these succeeds, that B cell starts to make more and more of that antibody. In fact, it makes more and more of them, and every once in a while, it will do a random little change to see if the random little change might make it even better. So your antibodies can actually get more and more adapted to attacking something. So that's where the idea of a vaccine comes in, because what is making those antibodies is the fact that these little antigens are being presented to the machinery that knows how to make antibodies. So there's a particular protein on the virus called the spike protein. It's the thing sticking out there, and that's what lets it get in. And these vaccines that we have, they encode the RNA, the recipe that makes the spike protein. So it's as though they're going to create a bunch of these little spike proteins, but nothing else that's in the virus. Okay? So with all the RNA that is in the virus, only a little portion of it is in the vaccine. It's the portion that creates the spike protein, which does not create any sickness. It can't make you ill. So this that little bit of RNA gets wrapped in something called a lipid nanoparticle, and that's something that protects it until it finds a cell. And that lipid is very similar to the cell membrane, so it's able to fuse with the cell and the RNA can get in the cell. Oh, I have a picture for this here. Okay, so the mRNA sequence that builds the spike protein, it gets coded, it gets injected into you, it gets into your cell, and your cell, those cooks that know how to read that Portuguese recipe, hold on, I'm getting weird flashing. Those cooks start making a bunch of those spike proteins. And those spike proteins have nowhere to go but to the walls of your cell. And so they appear on the outside of the walls of the cell, and along comes the immune system. It sees these cells that have bad proteins on them, antigens. It kills the cells, it takes them to the lymph, they build antibodies, and lo and behold, you're building antibodies that will work against the spike protein of the virus, because you essentially, your body created a bunch of these spike proteins. So it's a wonderful thing. And if you, uh, so the end result of this is you'll have all these antibodies. And then if you actually get exposed to the coronavirus, when the virus, gets into your bloodstream and around your cells and all that, a lot of those viruses will be attacked by the antibodies and will not even be able to get into your cells. Some will probably make it into the cells, a small number of them, but the antibody production will ramp up, and before you know it, everything's gonna be tagged, everything's gonna be dealt with, and you will get over the sickness. So the what the vaccine has done is give your body what it needs to fight off the infection so fast that you won't get sick, and probably fast enough so that you won't even be infectious. That's not entirely known yet, but it is probably the case. So when this happens, because the moment those spike proteins end up on the cell walls, your body acts like it's being attacked by an invader. Your immune system will kick into gear. So you'll experience symptoms like fever, maybe some inflammation, especially in the arm where you're shot. You may have some general ickiness, but none of the other proteins that really mess up your immune system that are in the coronavirus, none of those are being created. So these symptoms should be minor and you should generally get over them in a day. Meanwhile, about 12 days after your first dose, you'll have like 90% protection against the coronavirus. And then when you go in about a month later, and you could probably go in up to 2 or 3 months later if there's a supply situation. It's probably not going to be a big deal if it takes 2 or 3 months to get in. Um, you'll get a second shot, and it will boost things and make it longer lasting. And right now, it looks like these things are 95% effective, which is really tremendous. And um, that effectiveness is what's going to get us out of this pandemic and get us back to the point where we don't have to wear masks and we can go to sports games and all that. Couple things I want to mention: that RNA that gets injected into you, it doesn't really last that long. It's going to have it'll be present in your cell for I think a number of days, but all RNA eventually deteriorates, and your cells know how to break it down. They know how to dispose of it and reuse the parts for other things. So it's not like it hangs around in you forever. The phase 3 trials, the final trials that were done for these vaccines, both had about 40,000 participants each, and they had very high numbers of people of color. They wanted all races and ethnicities represented, so that if there was any kind of difference in the immunological effects between races, they wanted to know that. And half of the people got the vaccine, half got like a saltwater injection, a placebo. And they followed them for, at this point it's been like 4 months, 5 months, probably about 5 months for them. And they track who gets infected, who doesn't, and that's how they calculate how effective it is. But also importantly, they make it so big so that they can find out what kind of side effects there are. And these have been found to have a very high safety profile. The main thing that has kind of made the news is that a small number of people who get the vaccine, and I'm talking like maybe 5 to 10 people out of a million, it seems, experience an allergic reaction. And the vast majority of those that experience an allergic reaction already have allergies. They probably already carry EpiPens with them. And so it's important when you go to get your vaccine and they present you the list of all the questions and stuff like that, that you make it very clear if you have a history of allergies, particularly if you've ever had an allergic reaction to a vaccine. But these, as far as I know, those allergic reactions are generally dealt with on site. In general, they have you wait like 30 minutes in the area where you got vaccinated so that they can make sure you're not going to have an allergic reaction. They'll have EpiPens available. So that really, I think for most people that just shouldn't be a concern. And the benefits of the vaccine are huge compared to the risks. I mean, this is the way that we will emerge from the pandemic and get back to normal. And once we get the most vulnerable vaccinated, once the most, the 10 to 20% most vulnerable in society are vaccinated, we'll start to see the death rate numbers come way down. And once we get like maybe a third of the population vaccinated, with all that are kind of immune from having had COVID already, we'll really start to see a decrease in the infection numbers. And when we get to having like 70% of the or 80% of the population either vaccinated or having had some immunity from having had COVID, then we're going to be going outside without masks and getting life back to normal. So I hope that when everyone gets the chance, they will decide to get vaccinated and follow through on getting the second dose, when the time comes. A lot of effort is being made sure, is being gone to make sure that people get both doses. And by all means, you should. And with that, I'm going to stop the current recording